Hello, everyone. Welcome to our briefing on the Atlantic hurricane season. My name is Mary Chapman. I am Manager of Client Communications at WorldAware. I will be your moderator for the briefing. I would now like to introduce Andrew Markowitz, Intelligence Analyst for Environment at WorldAware. Andrew joined WorldAware in July 2019 after graduating from Penn State University with a BS in Meteorology and a minor in Energy Business and Finance, and focus on weather risk management. Prior to working at WorldAware, Andrew also worked at AccuWeather, where he created TV, radio, and newspaper forecasts for clients across the US.
Thank you very much, Mary. So I've had a lifelong passion for meteorology, and today I'm going to go into what we can expect for the rest of the 2019 Atlantic hurricane season. So we're going to go back and look at what has happened so far in the Atlantic Basin, tell you what's happening right now, including with Hurricane Dorian, and then going through the four main factors that we like to look at in order to determine what the rest of the season is going to look like, and then putting it all together and giving you our official WorldAware outlook. So a recap of the 2019 season so far, there have been 3 storms that have completed their life cycle. The first one was Subtropical Storm Andrea, which formed on May 20th, and the significance of that is the tropical season does not typically start until June 1st, so this is the 5th consecutive season where we have had a storm form before the official start of the season, and Andrea was very short-lived and no impact to land, but it was not a tropical storm because it lacked the defined tropical characteristics that we see because it interacted with a cold front that was in the southeast US. The most impactful of the 3 completed storms so far was Hurricane Barry, and this was another storm that developed in kind of an unusual fashion, since originally it was a line of thunderstorms in the Midwest that brought severe weather, and then retrograded southward into the southeast Gulf Coast, reformed as with the center of circulation in the Gulf of Mexico, and then eventually made landfall as a Category 1 hurricane in central Louisiana. And in total, Barry was pretty destructive as it did over $600 million of damage due to the combination of storm surge, strong winds, and almost 2 feet of rain in some places. And the last one was Tropical Storm Chantal, which formed in middle of August, and the significance of that storm was, while it was short-lived, it formed pretty far north in the Atlantic Basin at 40.2 degrees north. To put things in perspective, this was east of New Jersey, and in fact, this was the furthest north a storm has formed since 1988. So what are the main takeaways from the season so far? So you can see it's been a pretty inactive start to the season, at least until recently, which I'll get into in a minute. As between when Barry dissipated on July 15th and when Chantal formed on August 20th, there were no storms in the Atlantic Basin. And this stretch of inactivity is the longest that we've seen since 1982. But does that necessarily mean that the rest of the season will be inactive? Well, based on climatology, that's definitely not the case, as over 80% of our tropical storms and hurricanes dating back to unobserved history have formed after August 15th, and we are just now getting into the climatological peak. In fact, if we take a look at the Atlantic Basin right now, we see activity is already ramped up quite a bit. So we have Erin to our north, which is bringing pretty heavy rainfall to parts of southern and eastern New England, as well as eastern Canada tomorrow. But then obviously the big story is Dorian, which passed through the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico earlier. And it is now in open waters, and it is expected to make a westward turn at some point and could bring very significant impacts to parts of the U.S., specifically the southeast coast and into Florida. The latest National Hurricane Center update has it strengthening to a major hurricane, perhaps even a Category 4 by the time it makes landfall in the U.S., which would be early next week, Sunday and Monday. And while the track is uncertain, we do expect there to be high impacts, and we expect it to be a situation definitely worth monitoring. So now going through the 4 main environmental factors that affect tropical development. The first one, which is kind of the overarching thing, and the first one we like to look at, is the El Nino Southern Oscillation State, known as ENSO. And these are sea surface temperature anomalies in a box in the Pacific Ocean. And when you have temperatures greater than 0.5 degrees Celsius above normal, this is what is known as an El Nino. When it's greater than or equal to negative 0.5 degrees Celsius, that is what is known as a La Nina. And if it's somewhere in between, that's what's known as La Nada. And right now we are in a kind of a transition, which I'll allude to in a little bit more detail. And the next thing we like to look at is Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies. So the main idea is that when you have tropical cyclones, you'd like to see warmer waters because that could lead to more energy being put into these tropical cyclones, more moisture, and allows them to strengthen. So I'll show you a look at that in a minute. Another factor is wind shear, which is the change in wind speed and direction with height, and that affects the vertical structure of hurricanes. So you can see hurricanes are pretty symmetrical, and when you have low wind shear, that can allow it to maintain its symmetry and allow it to strengthen, whereas when you have high wind shear, that is inhibiting a hurricane's development and can actually lead to it to weaken or dissipate. And then the last thing we like to look at is something called teleconnections, and there are a bunch of them that we like to look at around the world. They impact our large-scale weather patterns in the atmosphere. But the one I'm going to focus on today is what is known as the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, which I'll provide more detail about in a few minutes. So the first factor we like to look at is the ENSO state, and we were in a weak El Nino dating back to September 2018, but we have transitioned as of this month to a warm neutral state, or what is known as La Nada. And the significance of that is El Nino tends to impact the jet stream and does so in a way that it increases from wind shear in the Atlantic basin, which, as I mentioned before, inhibits tropical development. So what does this mean that we've transitioned? The fact that we've gone from a weak El Nino to a La Nada state means that the effects are mitigated, and so the odds of a below normal hurricane season have been reduced. And in fact, I've come up with a chart of dating back to 1950, the average number of hurricanes per season and how it relates to the ENSO state. So our average is 12 tropical systems per year with 6 hurricanes and 2 or 3 major hurricanes. We have above normal during La Nina years, and even La Nada years, it's right around normal. But in El Nino years, typically we can expect 75% of the average, although with a weak El Nino, it's still below average, but not quite what you would expect in El Nino. Whereas when you have the neutral warm state that we're in, those numbers increase more towards the average. And now looking at your current Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies. So on this chart right here, the reds, oranges, and yellows represent above normal temperatures, and the blues and the greens represent below normal temperatures. So the key areas I wanted to highlight are in the Gulf of Mexico and near the Bahamas, as well as off the coast of Africa. So off the coast of Africa, you can see below normal temperatures. And the significance of that is that's an area what is known as the main development region, which is where a lot of the tropical cyclones historically originate. So when you have below normal temperatures in that region, as well as Saharan dust, which I'll explain more in a minute, that inhibits tropical development in that area, which is crucial for our season forecast. But you can see very warm waters in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Bahamas, and that tells us that when you have tropical systems in those areas, that they can strengthen rapidly, and you're already seeing that with Dorian, which has already become a hurricane and is expected to strengthen pretty quickly. The next factor that I'm looking into is wind shear, and the area that I wanted to focus on is off the coast of Africa. We have a high amount of Saharan dust present, although not as much as we saw earlier in the season, as the dust plume in July was extended all the way into the Caribbean, which is why you saw no named storms during that period. And what this dust does is it provides a lot of dry air, and that just inhibits development. You like to see pretty high moisture content. So as long as this plume of dry air remains in place, we're going to see limited development off the coast of Africa, which, again, as I mentioned before, is where you see a lot of these storms developing. So that inhibits development for the immediate time frame. And then lastly, we look at teleconnections. So the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, as you can kind of suspect by the name, this is a long-term, as in 20 to 30-year cycle of sea surface temperature anomalies in the North Atlantic basin. And why do we care about that? Well, it's because, as I mentioned before, warmer waters are better for hurricanes. And so since 1995, and especially in 2019, currently, we are in the warm phase. And during a warm phase, there is a very high correlation between being in the warm phase and active tropical seasons, whereas if you're in the cold phase, this is highly correlated with below normal seasons. So the fact that we remain in the warm phase, in fact, more so than we were in 2018, this tells us that an active season is perhaps in the cards. So based on all of these factors above, we've decided to go with about an average number of tropical storms and hurricanes for the rest of the season, although there are certainly areas of uncertainty. We have already seen activity ramp up through the end of August, and we can expect that to continue in September. As I alluded to before, the main limiting factor that we see is the amount of Saharan dust present. So if you can see it be reduced in that area, we can see more tropical cyclones form, and in that case, that could increase our development.
Thank you, Andrew. Next, we'll be hearing from Bob Howell, Director for Critical Operations at WorldAware. Bob is a key component to our Global Assistance and Response Division, advising and mentoring client decision makers on operational planning and risk mitigation strategies for operating globally with confidence.
Thank you, Mary. I want to take time today, and thank you everybody for joining, but I want to take time today to cover some preparedness for hurricane and typhoons. And we're going to discuss that in a couple different categories. We're going to talk about business continuity of operations, and then we're also going to address preparedness for expats and travelers. With respect to business continuity, of course, we want to review our business continuity, crisis management, and local incident management plans. We want to make sure that they're current, that they're up to date, all contact information is accurate and available. We want to ensure and test our corporate communications plan, not only how we communicate with corporate crisis management teams, but also higher headquarters for further direction, advice, and assistance. And then how do you communicate with local employees, and don't forget expats and travelers as well. We want to conduct a vulnerability assessment of your facilities with considerations for the impact of high winds, flooding, or loss of power. We want to reassess, fuel resupply for generators and status of backup batteries with respect to telephone systems and other network and systems within your facilities. We also want to establish a near real-time weather monitoring process within the organization, so you can provide routine updates as needed, both to employees and travelers that are visiting that location. We want to determine what your trigger is for a work from home order, right? When do you let people start to work from home rather than coming to the office? And that's going to be an important trigger to establish when you activate that. We're going to want to share the location of disaster relief centers with local employees and travelers as well. This is important. A lot of times we share this with local employees, but what about your travelers? Anybody that's traveling through the area or coming into the area, they should be aware of these as well. You want to review post-disaster relief communications plans with employees and travelers. Keeping in mind that mobile SMS may be your more reliable communication means. Typically in severe disasters or events, mobile cell phone networks are either overloaded or they may be shut down for a period of time. So you want to communicate any way you can: email, phone calls, SMS. SMS and a lot of times has a better reliability of getting through in a natural disaster or during heavy communication traffic. You want to review how employees and travelers request assistance if needed. So if they need assistance during or after an event, what company phone numbers do they call? What company contacts do they call? Don't forget about local 911 numbers as well, so that they can request assistance from local authorities as well. Going on to expats and travelers in particular. So here again, they're going to want to stay abreast of current weather updates and the potential impact, and know when to seek higher ground. Typically with hurricanes and typhoons, we see significant rainfall, and with respect to Dorian right now, we do expect some heavy rainfalls there. So need to locate higher ground locations that they might be able to move to, and be prepared to move to higher ground if need be. They should be familiarized themselves with the location of diplomatic missions, hospitals, fire, police stations, and disaster relief centers, and potential evacuation sites as well. And then register with diplomatic mission. So for the U.S. State Department, that's the STEP program, but almost every diplomatic mission has some type of program for travelers and employees and to be able to register with, just so that they are aware who's in country, and then they typically send out advisory information too via email, and then in a natural disaster, they may actually be calling mobile phone numbers. Review the company communication plan and how to seek assistance if needed. Again, same thing for travelers here. So they need to know who to call, who to reach out to for advice and assistance. And again, don't forget local emergency numbers as well. Establishing rally points. Should you be separated from family or coworkers? Particularly like with expats that have family members, they need to establish a couple of different rally points so that if by chance they're separated, they know where to go look to try to find family members and reconnect. Same thing with coworkers. You know, it might be the office location, it might be a park, it might be a cathedral, but establishing a couple of rally points where you can reconnect if need be. Making use of redundant communication means. So it's important that any communication plan is redundant. So you've got email, you've got mobile phone, SMS, social media can be used as well. And then some remote locations, you may want to consider satellite communications. Keep a coworkers and family or friends fully informed of your travel itinerary. Many times travelers will land in a certain location, like they'll land in one city, but then they'll travel to a different city. And if coworkers, families, or friends don't know that you've traveled there, then we would not be aware that you may be impacted by an event. So it's important that you keep family, friends, coworkers informed about your total travel itinerary so people have the ability to identify who may be impacted and can validate safety and well-being. Go bag. This is an important scenario here. Even here in the United States, myself and other comrades, we keep go bags, but particularly if you're in a disaster zone and a hurricane or typhoon season, this is important. So you want to have a waterproof backpack. You want to keep your important documentation in there, passports, personal identification, extra photocopies of those on hand as well. Food and water for up to 72 hours. And don't forget any medical prescriptions that might be necessary. Then, of course, a basic first aid kit is also part of your grab bag essentials. Water purification. There are many portable water purification systems now that you can fit into a backpack. Sanitation and travel-sized toiletries, and, of course, extra clothes. You want to make sure you have a communications means, phone, a whistle for signaling, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and of course extra batteries, not only for your flashlight, but what about backup battery supplies for your mobile phone, right? You need to be able to continue to communicate. If you're in a prolonged situation where lack of power, then you can also set up a check-in schedule on a mobile phone where your family and friends will know that, you know, at every 4 hours, you're going to turn the phone on and I'll be able to receive messages or communicate at that time. You also want to have a credit card and extra cash on hand. It's important to understand that in any major event or disaster, local services are usually shut down and their cash becomes king. So it's important that, for example, you might have $200 cash in your go bag. That helps you in those kind of scenarios. A credit card is also very helpful. Debit cards tend not to be very useful because if you got a power failure, the ATMs aren't going to be working. And if it's a major disaster, you may not even be able to get to an ATM. And so these are some basic risk mitigation strategies and preparedness strategies, both from a business continuity of operations and from a expat and traveler standpoint, and we should help you greatly in preparing and getting in front of the situation to ensure your safety and well-being.
Thank you, Bob. On behalf of WorldAware and our presenters, thank you for listening to our briefing. Visit worldaware.com to access the peak hurricane season forecast and additional business continuity tips.